This is Almere reporting for Primeur Magazine from our studio in Almere. And we're talking here today with Addison Snell from Intersect360 Research about the latest reports and the latest findings about the HPC market. So, welcome, Addison.
Thanks, Odd, for having me into your virtual studio. This is fun.
Okay. And I think discussing the HPC market is even more fun because you recently published the new reports. And can you just give a few first impression of your findings?
Sure. Intersect360 Research, first of all, we're industry analysts who cover high performance computing and hyperscale markets, and that includes major trends like machine learning or artificial intelligence, data science, cloud, to the extent that they transcend all of those areas. And really what we're talking about here is the high performance computing portion of the market. And we're happy to report that in 2019, it showed healthy growth. It was up 8.2%, which was a point better than we had originally forecast. It's about $39 billion worldwide. Now, the hardware or on-premise portions of that, the biggest ones in terms of servers and storage, showed much more modest growth between 2 and 3%. Where the big growth really came in the market was, of course, in cloud computing types of deployments, which has been growing at double-digit rates. That's people who are using cloud computing or public cloud computing to run their high-performance computing applications. And then also we saw a big spike in what we could call cloud-like sorts of deployments that aren't strictly public cloud, but we're talking about things like managed services contracts, facilities outsourcing, other types of utility or outsourcing that aren't strictly public cloud. Those were also well up in the 2019 numbers and contributed to that solid growth rate.
So does that mean that in the end everything will be cloud, or is there still a market for the on-premise HPC in the future?
Yeah, certainly not everything moving to cloud. High performance computing is still solidly, predominantly an on-premise market. However, we have seen a very rapid growth in cloud for starting with bursting types of applications, but I think there will be a long-term role for cloud, particularly as a playground for new applications, new workloads, and new technologies, and matching those together. I think organizations will find a way to use cloud as a way to figure out where they want to go directionally. But just economically, most of high performance computing tends to run at a fairly high utilization rate on premise. These are sophisticated users who know what they're doing. And economically, for the majority of the market, it still works out better for that to stay on premise. Cloud is a portion of the market. It's growing very rapidly. It'll take up a larger portion of the market, but this will still be predominantly on premise throughout the forecast.
So that were the findings for 2019. In 2020, we saw, I think, one very positive thing in high-performance computing, the Fugaku supercomputing, which was a marvelous machine. Right. But apart from that, the whole market, I think, more or less collapsed, like a lot of other things.
Well, 2020 is still a forecast, of course. We'll have to wait till the end of the year to really total up the end of the year numbers. I do want to spend a moment and talk about Fugaku. What a marvelous machine. Fujitsu's been on the top of the top 500 list a couple of times now. And this Fugaku machine at Riken is really an outstanding achievement and uses a very interesting A64FX ARM-based processor, which is the first time we've really seen that at this level of scale. Uses the Tofu interconnect from Fujitsu. I think there are going to be a lot of eyes on this machine in terms of how efficient it is for high performance computing applications. And it was a real achievement for them to deliver that ahead of schedule so that those cycles could be used for COVID-19 research, which there's a great need for in the scientific computing space right now, which bridges us to the other major point about 2020, which is that here we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and that's what's really got the forecast gone in an interesting direction right now. It's had a tremendous effect on the worldwide economy, and that will have an effect on high performance computing spending this year. We're now forecasting a decline of 3.7% year over year. Now, that's not just a 3.7% loss, but really you have to look at it's down from the growth that we would have originally forecast. It was in the neighborhood of about 7%. So this is a much greater loss than that, to say you're going to wipe out all of that growth. And we're actually going to see the first loss in this market since the last recession period in 2009.
You say that when I read your report, you say that yeah, it is a decline now, but the market will catch up, and eventually 2024 or something like that, we will be back on track. So we will be at the level that we had before the crisis. Is that correct?
Right. Overall, there's been a very little effect on the long-term compound annual growth rate, or the health of the market, and that's because we're monitoring essentially the underlying demand for scientific and technical computing isn't going anywhere. So the majority of spending this year that doesn't happen, most of that is deferred rather than delayed. So the first thing that happens is, while we have a down 2020, then there will be a rebound spike in 2021. And what looks like this tremendously high growth rate, but a lot of that is just um, purchases or acquisitions that were delayed from 2020 into 2021. And then we could even see a little bit of an echo effect in 2022 being down a bit and 2023 up a bit. And that just has to do with purchase cycles, budget cycles, before it evens out again by the end of the 5-year forecast. And we get pretty much back to where we would have been. Now, that's not to say there's no real loss, because when I was describing those uh, troughs or valleys, dips in the market, followed by the spikes in the market, what happens with that is the troughs are deeper than the peaks are high. So there is real loss that goes on. There's some purchases that don't come back, but in terms of the long-term growth rate, there's very little effect. And by the time we get to the end of the 5-year forecast, we're about back where we would have been. And this is something we've seen before. When we look back at our numbers from 2009 and the 5 years that followed, that's pretty much the pattern that we saw there, that we were able to measure, and we expect to see the same thing again. And I'll say one more quick thing. There's a quick caveat, which is it's hard for us as HPC analysts to forecast a pandemic. We're not epidemiologists. Our forecast premise is based on the idea that the economic effects of the pandemic are primarily constrained to this calendar year, and that by 2021, early 2021 at the least, we get back to more normal business spending, even if the shape of some of it changes. If that doesn't happen, and we're still seeing the pandemic having a major economic effect in 2021, then we're going to have to rip up the forecast and go do a new one again.
But then you assume that there will be no major change in the demand part of the market, and that we will be back at the old expected level.
That's right.
But in previous crisis, there was that was more a supplier side crisis, an overall crisis. But this time it's perhaps different. We could, for instance, say that the airline industry is staying very low and will not recover, and that could have an impact on engineering industry, and hence also on the need for HPC systems. And there are other industries like that. So are you taking that into account?
That's right. Right now, we don't. I suppose that if you say we're going to wipe out the airline industry and people aren't going to fly, or they're not going to fly to the extent they did before, then that could have a deleterious effect where you're taking out HPC spending from the aerospace industry. At this point, we think that mostly people return to flying, people return to buying cars, people return to needing gas for their cars, which is the energy market. People return to spending money in retail in some level. Now that could change. They could be spending more online and less on brick and mortar, but the HPC that goes into the analytics of retail is still there. Some of it might shift more to cloud and less to on-premise. And that could happen. But really, when we look vertical market by vertical market or workload by workload, right now it looks like there's not any sort of long-term impact that would really wipe those out. Now, I mentioned cloud, and I'll say one other thing quickly about cloud is that cloud we think is going to have the reverse effect of the other sorts of spending that we're monitoring, because when you constrain on-premise spending, cloud is something that can absorb a lot of that gap. So when everything else goes down, cloud will go up to an extent, not to where it fills in the entire gap, but cloud will follow the reverse trend from everything else because of the nature of cloud to be flexible in times of uncertainty. So that'll be an interesting effect, that cloud spending should actually be up in 2020 while everything else is down.
Yeah, I understand it's very, very difficult to make predictions in these times.
Well, that's what we do. That's our
Oh
job.
yeah,
We
of course. I mean,
predictions and our guidance.
that's why we're talking, because you make predictions. One other thing which I would like to discuss, that is that we mentioned the Fujaku already, but there are other exascale programs in the US and in Europe, and they all try to have an impact on the development of high performance computing. But the question is, do they have a real influence in the sense that the complete market is affected in a, let's say, a positive way, or is it that they just have a minor ripple on the industry? So do they really help these exascale support programs in Japan, the US, China, Europe?
They do have influence that goes beyond the spending on those systems themselves. Now, the race to exascale, of course, does put real money into the market in terms of those supercomputers that get bought and deployed, and we count those. But then there is a, a halo effect that goes through the rest of the market. And one thing that we've noticed started in 2019 is that government spending really came back to the forefront, leading the growth rate by sector, ahead even of commercial. That ended a string of 6 straight years in which the commercial markets had the highest growth rate. Before that, it was academia. And we've really come through years of relative government austerity in multiple geographies. US government spending was constrained. European or Eurozone spending was constrained for many years. We had similar constraints in Japan, in China. And what we're really seeing that in part is related to the race to exascale, in part is related to artificial intelligence, but really a lot of that government spending is coming back, and we're now forecasting that over the next 5-year period, it's going to be the government sector that has the highest growth rate over that 5-year period. It'll also be more stable relative to the commercial spending, which is going to have a lot more of the variability due to COVID. Government will have maybe some variability, but really should be much more stable through the pandemic. Out of all the commercial segments, the one that'll be the most stable is biosciences related to pharmaceuticals and other sorts of research, which of course is getting a lot of attention during the pandemic. But generally, what we'll see is government more stable and higher growth rate. Government will still have a good growth rate, but it'll have a lot of variability as a result of the pandemic.
Did we discuss all the major findings and predictions of your survey and of your reports?
Well, there are many other things that I could go on highlighting. The great thing with high performance computing is that I could talk about it all day, and it's a fascinating area. I think the big thing that I would underline is that the need for high performance computing doesn't go away. The great thing about science is that we don't get to the end of it. You solve one problem, there's another problem on the horizon, and then that leads to engineering and other forms of innovation. So this is a long-term stable market because we don't run out of problems to solve. And then beyond that, we're adding in data science and machine learning, everything with artificial intelligence. So really it's those underlying demand side growth factors that lead us to conclude that the market comes back. There's going to be a need for this type of computing, and that's what keeps us busy as analysts. So it's an exciting time to be in high performance computing.
Thanks very much for this interview. I surely hope we can meet at some real live conference next
I hope
time.
so. I'll see you back on the conference circuit maybe in 2021, Ott. Thanks for having me on your screen.
Thanks, Addison. For Primeur Magazine, this was Addison reporting.